Good day. Today is Wednesday, 12th March 2025. And as I make the program, there are lots of stories dominating the media around the world, reports of an imminent recession, an overdue recession, in my opinion, more information about tariffs and retaliatory tariffs and trade disagreements between the United States and the European states. However, the big story, the one that I'm going to focus on obviously in this program, is firstly the events in Kursk region, the final collapse of the Ukrainian force in Kursk, and then afterwards, and in that order, I will discuss the results of the meeting between the Ukrainians and the Americans in Jeddah. Now, many may be surprised that I'm choosing that particular order. I'm sure many people will think that the more important story is the discussion between the Americans and the Ukrainians and the joint statement that the two countries agreed to. But the first thing to say is that it's never absolutely clear, even at this stage, how important statements like that really are going to be, because the other party, the main party in these discussions, Russia, has so far not been involved. And, the other thing is that if I start talking about all of the diplomacy, it's likely that the important events in Sudzha, the critically important events in Sudzha, in Kursk region, are going to be overlooked. And I say that because that has been the pattern right across the media this morning. The fact that the Americans and the Ukrainians have come to some sort of a consensus with each other, and it's an interesting consensus, and it's rather different, in my opinion, from what many people think it is. Anyway, the fact that the Americans and the Ukrainians have reached a consensus on some issues, and the joint statement that they have published, and in particular the talk about a 30-day ceasefire, all of that is taking away attention from the important developments in Kursk region. It's, I think, a mistake to do this, because this remains a war, and if we don't talk about the actual fighting in the war, if we don't get a sense of how the battle is moving, we are likely to lose sight of the actual events in a way that will probably lead us to all kinds of wrong conclusions about what might happen. Because, to repeat again, and it's a point I made in many programs, it is the military developments that dictate the diplomacy, not the other way round. That is the way it is in all wars, and there is no reason to think that this war is any different. Now, when I did my program yesterday, I discussed how a whole series of villages clustered around Sudzha, this small town of about 6,000 people, which was the only significant urban community that the Ukrainians were ever able to capture in Kursk region. That a whole series of villages, Cherkasskaya, Porechnoye, Kazachya, Loknya, all of those had all tumbled under Russian control, one after the other, with minimal resistance from the Ukrainians. There are lots of pictures of Ukrainian troops fleeing from these places in a state of chaos and disorganization, which suggested panic. There was pictures of Russian soldiers moving and occupying abandoned Ukrainian positions. And just as I was about to start the program yesterday, the reports started to trickle in that the Russians had actually entered Sudzha itself. And over the course of yesterday's program, I speculated that over the course of the next 12, 24 hours, we would get reports that Sudzha had fallen entirely under Russian control. Well, that seems to be what has happened. Now, we have lots of pictures now of Russian soldiers in Sudzha. Yesterday, I spoke about the single photograph that I'd seen, supposedly taken by a Russian soldier, showing certain buildings in Sudzha. I pointed out that in that photograph, there was no visible person at all, and the photograph in and of itself, therefore, could not confirm the actual presence of the Russians in Sudzha. But almost immediately after I finished my program, I started to see photographs tumbling in, all of which did actually show Russian soldiers in Sudzha, moving around without much sign that they felt under any threat and facing no real danger. Well, more information trickled through over the next few hours. This morning, it appeared that the Russians were in full control of the center of Sudzha. And again, there was little sign of any Ukrainian resistance. In fact, there was no sign of any Ukrainian resistance at all. In other places, in other communities, the Ukrainians have fought bitterly to defend their positions and to hold off the Russians. Well, I saw no evidence of this in these pictures, the pictures that I saw either yesterday, in the evening yesterday, or this morning. Now, Ukrainian reporting channels, DS for example, are claiming that there are still places in Sudzha where the Ukrainians are still located, that the Ukrainian troops still occupy parts of Sudzha. Sudzha is a very complex community. It's basically, or it seems to me to be, basically a cluster of small, well, village-like communities. Only it's important to say that we're talking about not really villages, because these are apartment buildings and things of that kind. But anyway, it's a cluster of communities, somewhat dispersed, to some extent isolated from each other. There is a central core area, which, as I said, the Russians indisputably control. But even though it is a small place, you could call it a place a little bit like a kind of star, where there's a small central area, and then there's various communities that, or suburbs, if you like, that cluster around that star. So it is possible that the Russians control central Sudzha, perhaps the north of Sudzha, and the eastern part of Sudzha, but that there are still Ukrainian troops located in some other parts of Sudzha in the west. During the fighting in August, when the Ukrainians entered Sudzha, I remember that was the case. The Ukrainians captured territory in the west of Sudzha and eventually reached the center of Sudzha. But for some time, for several days, there were still Russian soldiers, Russian units stationed and in control of some of Sudzha's eastern suburbs. I don't think this is the case this time. The state of the Ukrainian military is far too disorganized and chaotic to make any genuine stand, any real stand, of Ukrainian troops in any part of Sudzha effective. No doubt, or quite plausibly, within Sudzha itself, and indeed, by the way, in the forests and woods further north and around Sudzha, in the villages, in some of the villages that the Russians have captured, there are still small groups of Ukrainian soldiers or isolated Ukrainian soldiers who are still not surrendered, and perhaps who don't quite know what to do, and are themselves perhaps either looking to escape still, or maybe in some cases they're still prepared to put up resistance and fight. But we are not talking about an organized presence in any one place. And I think that certainly by the end of today, the Russians will be in firm control of the whole of Sudzha. Now, Sudzha was the core of the territory in Kursk region that the Ukrainians captured. According to them, at one point, it extended to 1,500 square kilometers. It's obviously ceased to be anything of that size, for some time now. Frankly, after the capture of Sudzha, maybe there are few small settlements and communities, villages and hamlets and those places still nominally in Russian territory, where there is still a Ukrainian presence between Sudzha and the border. But again, I don't seriously believe the Ukrainians are going to hold on or try to hold on to these villages for very long. Today, we can speak of the final failure, the complete collapse, the defeat of Ukraine's Kursk offensive, the one it began in August 2024. This is the second offensive that Ukraine undertook since the spring of 2023. The first was the Great Summer Offensive of 2023, which aimed to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea. It had a rather grisly sequel with an attempt to advance also towards the Black Sea by crossing the Dnieper in Kherson region. That sequel ended horribly in this hideous battle in Krinky, where the Ukrainian troops found themselves basically encircled by the Russians and defeated and driven back. Well, this offensive, the offensive that the Ukrainians launched in August 2024, the Kursk offensive, has ended every bit as disastrously. And if you believe the Russians, and by the way, here I basically do, the losses that Ukraine has experienced over the course of this Kursk offensive have been as high, or perhaps higher still, than the losses that Ukraine experienced during the offensive of 2023, when the Ukrainians tried to break through to the Black Sea and to the Sea of Azov. I don't have the exact figures, but the landscape in Kursk region around the roads, especially the roads leading northward from Sudzha, are littered with burnt out and destroyed Ukrainian armoured vehicles and other vehicles. And though, of course, the exact number of casualties, the losses that the Ukrainians have suffered over the course of this offensive will always remain, I suspect, a point of contention. I have no doubt that those losses number in the thousands and perhaps even the tens of thousands. So I think that the Russian claim that the Kursk offensive has inflicted more damage on the Ukrainian military than the summer 2023 offensive did is probably true. Now, again, to repeat a point that I made about Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive many times, that offensive didn't just fail, the Russian army defeated it. If one army launches an offensive and that offensive is repelled by the defending army, then the army which has launched the offensive has been defeated. Not a single Western commentary that I have seen about Ukraine's 2023 offensive admits that fact. They all speak of the offensive as having failed, as if the Russians had no part in its failure. When we talk about the Kursk offensive that Ukraine launched in August 2024, that too has not just failed, it has been comprehensively and totally defeated by the Russians. This is not just a failure, it is a major military defeat. Now, it's also a defeat which at this stage in the war, if one looks at the balance of forces of the two armies, Ukraine is not in a position to absorb. When the Ukrainians have launched offensives before, or when they've lost battles, particularly before the 2023 offensive, there was enough resources and reserves in the Ukrainian army that they could afford losses on the scale of the losses that they have just experienced in Kursk region. Today, that is no longer the case. We get reports all the time about how short of manpower the Ukrainian military is, despite the resumption of American military aid, about which more shortly. The Ukrainian military constantly complains about the fact that it is short of weapons. A few months ago, there was endless talk about the delivery to Ukraine of Western fighter jets, of F-16s and Mirage 2000s. Well, some of them have been delivered. Some of them are actually apparently operational. And, well, they appear to be achieving nothing much at all. In fact, there was a report yesterday that the Ukrainians are dissatisfied with the Mirage 2000. They find that it isn't working very well, and it isn't achieving all the things that it was supposed to achieve. And no less a person than Yuri Ignat, the spokesperson of Ukraine's Air Force, has openly admitted that the F-16 that Ukraine has received is inferior, significantly inferior, to the Russian Sukhoi 35, of which the Russians have significantly more than the Ukrainians have F-16s. So, even in the air, where some people a year ago were thinking that the delivery of the F-16s and the Mirage 2000s would change the balance of the war, it's not doing so. And the Ukrainians endlessly complain about the fact that they're short of supplies, that they're short of artillery, they're short of shells, they're short of every conceivable thing. So, to repeat again, they don't have any longer the reserves that they once did. So, conducting an offensive like the one that they conducted in Kursk region was always an extraordinary gamble, a gamble which, in my opinion, had already failed within the first 5 days when they failed to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, which, to be clear again, was obviously their target, but a gamble which has failed catastrophically, given that it only ended in a defeat and in a loss of men and machines that Ukraine is going to struggle to replace. So, there we are. Now, I have to say that when the offensive in Kursk began back in August, the euphoria on the part of some people in the West, not just in the West, by the way, but the euphoria with which this was greeted by some people, the commentary about how the Ukrainians, Zelensky, had wrong-footed the Russians, how the Russians had been taken by surprise, how what a stroke of brilliance this offensive was. I remember even the intelligence chiefs of Britain and the United States coming together in September 2024 and also praising the brilliance and success of Ukraine's Kursk offensive. And the amount of reporting and coverage and talk about its success that one saw. Well, all of that, and now it's ended, and it's ended in failure and defeat and disaster, and no one wants to talk about that anymore. There's that old expression, apparently going back to the Romans, that whilst victory has many fathers, defeat is an orphan. And one senses that this is once again true with the Kursk offensive. All those people who once talked about the brilliance of this offensive, the extraordinary success that it had achieved, the way it had taken the fight to the Russians, the way in which it would shake Putin's control of the Kremlin and make the Russian people doubt him. Well, all of those people who were saying all of those things today are largely silent. And if you look at the Western media today, the enormous coverage that they gave to the start of the Kursk offensive finds no match in the coverage they are giving the Kursk defeat of today. They're barely covering it at all. You get a few reports here and there, but none of the commentary and discussion and the euphoric reports and the analysis and all of that we got then. Glenn Deason, with whom I do many videos, I'm privileged to do many videos which we publish on the Duran, has written a good piece about this, by the way, on his Substack blog, the extent to which the entire Ukraine war is basically framed in the West as a succession of narratives, and how the Kursk operation in its origins was one of those. And well, now that that narrative has collided with reality, what do? We switch it off. Now, I'm going to just here anticipate some more myths that I think are going to grow around it over the next couple of days or weeks, to the extent that the Western media wants to talk about it at all. I've already mentioned in my previous videos how inevitably some people in the West were going to say that the Ukrainian collapse in Kursk, was the product of the denial by the United States of intelligence assistance and weapons supplies to Ukraine. And I pointed out already that this makes absolutely no sense and is completely at variance with the known facts, the facts which, if you'd been following these programs, you would know about, because the Ukrainian position in Kursk region was deteriorating rapidly for weeks before the denial of intelligence and the stopping of military aid was announced and enforced by the United States. But that hasn't prevented people from saying this. The Institute for the Study of War has claimed it, and there's a whole article apparently in Forbes, which I haven't read, which apparently says the same thing. And I'm going to anticipate another narrative that we're going to hear soon, and this is that the Ukrainians, the reason for the Ukrainian collapse in Sudzha was not that there was a collapse. There was no actual collapse in Sudzha. The Ukrainians were fighting successfully and determinedly until eventually, because of the negotiations, the discussions that were taking place between themselves and the Americans in Jeddah, they took the decision to retreat in anticipation of the ceasefire and the negotiations with the Russians which were to come. In other words, that this was a retreat, something the Ukrainians decided to do, not a defeat at all. Now that is, can I say again, simply not true. It is entirely at variance with the facts. There have been several orderly retreats over the course of this war. There was the orderly retreat the Russians conducted from around Kiev in the early weeks of the special military operation, when it looked as if the Istanbul Agreement was about to be finalized. There was the equally orderly retreats that the Russians carried out, first from Kharkiv region and then from Kursk region, west of the Dnieper in the autumn of 2022, in the face of the Ukrainian counteroffensives in those regions. Those were carefully organized, very orderly affairs. What we've just seen in Kursk is none of those things. It has been chaotic, disorganized. There's been elements of panic, not just elements of panic, there's been panic stamped all over this affair. In no conceivable sense is it consistent with an orderly withdrawal. And of course, General Syrskyi himself, the Ukrainian commander, as I discussed in my program yesterday, as recently as Monday, was talking about the Ukrainians holding on to their positions in Kursk, perhaps being prepared to retreat in some places to more defendable positions, but overall having the situation completely under control, which of course is completely inconsistent with any orderly withdrawal taking place. And for the record, though, as I've said already, it is impossible to get a sense of the totality of Ukrainian losses over the last couple of days. I understand that they are very high and that a significant part of the force, the Ukrainian force, which was still located in Sudzha, has been defeated and destroyed. There have been thousands of men killed or injured or taken prisoner or lost in the woods. As I said, there is nothing about this affair that speaks of an orderly withdrawal, if that is something that is ever claimed. So the Russians have chalked up another important victory. They've done this during the period of the spring thaw, the period of the Rasputitsa. And of course, the unanswered question for me is not whether the Russians are going to advance into Sumy region. They are already in Sumy region. What further offensive plans they have there, I don't know, and I'm not going to speculate about, not in this program. But the big question is whether the obvious and weaknesses of the Ukrainian forces that we have seen in Kursk region, the collapse and panic and flight, is symptomatic of the larger Ukrainian army, or is specific to the force that the Ukrainians deployed in Kursk region. It could be that it is the first. I say that because all of the reports said that the Ukrainians were sending many of their best troops to Kursk region, and that they were the best supplied troops in Kursk. The troops in Kursk region were the best supplied troops anywhere across the entire theatre of the war. So it doesn't seem to me that the military units in Kursk region were weaker inherently than Ukrainian military units in other places. Just saying. So it may be, that the overall effect of the losses on the Ukrainian army as a whole has so exhausted and diluted its manpower and so severely undermined its morale that maybe Ukrainian forces right across the contact line are now as brittle as the ones we saw in Kursk. They'll put up a spirited resistance for a few weeks, but if the pressure becomes too strong, they might collapse just in the same way as we saw in Kursk region. Now, that would not be inconsistent with the effective attrition. The attrition the Russians have been waging against the Ukrainians for the last 3 years. The core of dedicated, motivated manpower with which the Ukrainians started the war has now been whittled away. The people who have replaced them are either much older or much younger. They don't share the motivation of the men that they are replacing, and they don't have their experience or their training. They're much more demoralized and far less willing to fight. And when the Russians hit, and hit hard, they crack and the defenses break down. Now, that's speculative. It may be that there were individual problems in Kursk region that explain this collapse, which don't apply to the rest of the Ukrainian army. But we must at least, I think, prepare for the possibility that these problems are more widespread than the force that fought in Kursk region. In which case, further collapses like the one we have just seen in Kursk region across the rest of the contact line are not impossible. And again, to repeat, this is not inconsistent with what we see over the course of attrition wars. In which case, it could be that if the war continues, and continues at the same pace and intensity as we have just seen, as we have seen over the last 3 years, that with the Ukrainian army exposed as so brittle, a military collapse will come a lot sooner than many people expect. And just to say, that would not just be consistent with attrition. It's probably something that the Russians, who are probably far better informed about the real state of the Ukrainian army than most commentators about the war are, probably better informed than Western governments are, and certainly far better informed than I am. That's something that the Russians probably know about and which they might take into account. If they have reason to think that the war is on the brink of being won because the Ukrainian ability to keep fighting is almost exhausted, that might affect their approach to any negotiations or to the negotiations that are now being talked about. Well, I'm not going to say more about this because I don't have the information to be able to make any sound judgments. I can't say whether Ukrainian units defending in, say, the area around Pokrovsk are as fragile as the Ukrainian units who are holding out in Sudzha. But, well, no doubt we will find out one way or the other if the war continues. And as I said, the Russians probably by now do have a pretty good idea. They'll have been keeping careful track of Ukrainian communications. They will have a lot of information about the state of the Ukrainian army from prisoners that they're taking and from the interrogation records of those prisoners. They're obviously also successfully monitoring Ukrainian communications. The former Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Shoigu, admitted as much. So it's quite likely that the Russians have that knowledge of the Ukrainian army that pretty much everyone else, perhaps even the Ukrainian High Command, lag. Anyway, we'll see. Now, that's what I wanted to say about this battle. Of course, the war goes on everywhere else as well. The story continues to be of Russian advances, but I'm not going to keep to that today. I'll probably come back to it in future programs. Let me now turn to the negotiations that took place between the United States and Ukraine not in Riyadh, not in the city of Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, but instead in Jeddah. Now, after these negotiations, these discussions, which lasted 85 hours. 85 hours is a very long time in negotiating sessions, and it suggests to me that a lot of the discussions were very contentious. Anyway, after those 85 hours of discussions, the two delegations published a joint statement. And I'm going to read it. And I'm going to do so after expressing my surprise that the actual text of this joint statement is receiving so little attention. I would expect it to receive much more attention than it is doing. You will find the full text on the State Department's website. It says this: today in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, under the gracious hospitality of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Interesting that the King of Saudi Arabia is not referenced, just saying, but anyway, there's always time with that. The United States and Ukraine took important steps toward restoring durable peace for Ukraine. Representatives of both nations praised the bravery of the Ukrainian people in defense of their nation and agreed that now is the time to begin a process toward lasting peace. So that's already an interesting sentence. It's not that the bravery of the Ukrainian nation has merited for Ukraine a place as an independent state, a state with insecure frontiers, a state that is entitled to preserve its independence and territorial integrity. The kind of boilerplate language you would certainly have seen if a joint Ukrainian and American statement had been published during the period of the Biden administration. This one says, yes, the Ukrainians have been very brave, but the time has now come to bring it all to an end and to agree to a peace, to a lasting peace. Nothing here about territorial integrity, sovereignty, independence, any of those things. And that's, I think, already an interesting omission. Anyway, we then have the next paragraph. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated the Ukrainian people's strong gratitude to President Trump, the US Congress, and the people of the United States for making possible meaningful progress toward peace. And this is again an interesting sentence. They're not thanking Donald Trump and the US Congress and the people of the United States for standing firmly alongside Ukraine in its bitter and heroic struggle for independence and sovereignty and all of that in the face of Russian aggression. They're thanking Donald Trump, the US Congress, and the American people for making possible meaningful progress towards peace. That is apparently what the Americans want to be thanked for, not the successful defense of Ukraine. And then The next paragraph reads, Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation. Now, here there are 2 points to make, and I'm going to return a lot to the topic of the ceasefire in the next part of the program. But notice, first of all, that it refers to mutual agreement by the parties. Which parties? Ukraine and Russia, or Ukraine, Russia, and the United States? I say that because the ceasefire has to be, it's acknowledged that it must be concurrent and accepted by, it must be accepted by and concurrently implemented by the Russian Federation. The Russians, in other words, obviously have to agree to it. Otherwise, it won't happen. But we are specifically told in this paragraph that the ceasefire, the proposal for the ceasefire, is an American one and that the Ukrainians have accepted it. Now, there is a major spin operation underway in London, even as I speak today. There's a big article about this in the BBC. That, in fact, this great idea for the ceasefire did not come from the Ukrainians or from the Americans. It was proposed by the British. The British didn't think much of Macron's plan of a ceasefire purely in the air and on the sea. They told the Ukrainians to go for an all-out ceasefire, and the Ukrainians brought this up with the Americans in this discussion in Jeddah, and the Americans accepted it. Well, this is a spin operation, and one can say that confidently because the actual joint statement flatly contradicts it. It says that the proposed ceasefire, the 30-day ceasefire, is a US proposal which Ukraine is accepting. Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire. The US proposal, not the British proposal, not the French proposal, not the Ukrainian proposal, the American proposal for a interim 30-day ceasefire. So the idea for the ceasefire comes from the Americans, and this statement makes it clear that it comes from no one else. The British, once again, are trying to fool everybody to think that they have a bigger role in these negotiations than they actually do. And I think that's a point that I would wish to make clear here. Ian Proud, by the way, on his blog, his Substack blog, has made exactly the same point, that the British are engaging in a spinning operation on behalf of the Starmer government to pretend that they are the people who came up with the idea for a ceasefire. That is obviously not true. Now, there is more about this paragraph, and here we need to go back to emissions, because the first thing, and it's a point made by an article in Strana, Ukrainian magazine, news magazine, media website, a very fine media magazine, by the way. I've read this article on the basis of a translation provided to me by Jeff Roberts. I just should acknowledge that first. Anyway, Strana has made the point that up to this time, Ukraine has consistently rejected a ceasefire. This has been the standard position of Ukraine throughout the war, at least since the decision to walk away from the Istanbul Agreement in 2022. I can remember this time last year, Ukraine was making statement after statement, emphatically rejecting, categorically rejecting any idea of a ceasefire. Then, as the military situation began to turn against Ukraine over the course of 2024, the Ukrainians started to shift their position, and though they never fully embraced the idea of a ceasefire, in fact, as recently as December, Zelensky was coming up with victory plans and plans of that kind. Anyway, they started to give hints and suggestions that maybe, just maybe, they might be persuaded that a ceasefire of some kind might be an option. But it was not the sort of ceasefire that is being referenced in this paragraph. Let me read the paragraph again. Ukraine expressed readiness to accept the US proposal to enact an immediate interim 30-day ceasefire, which can be extended by mutual agreement of the parties and which is subject to acceptance and concurrent implementation by the Russian Federation. The obvious shining omission is references to security guarantees. As recently as the Oval Office meeting between Zelensky on the one hand and Trump and Vance on the other, the meeting which exploded into this passionate and furious argument between the Americans and Zelensky. Zelensky was still saying that Ukraine would not accept a ceasefire unless it was backed by security guarantees provided ultimately by the United States. And the fact that this discussion in Jeddah went on for 8.5 hours strongly suggests to me that the Ukrainians went into this meeting in Jeddah still trying to get the Americans to agree to provide Ukraine with security guarantees. Now, I have said in recent programs that the very interesting thing about the Jeddah talks is first that they were happening in Jeddah, not in Europe or the United States, that it seemed to me that the United States, therefore, was deliberately taking steps to isolate the Ukrainian negotiators from their friends in Europe and their friends in the United States, by meeting them in Jeddah, where the Americans, through their Saudi friends, would be able to keep the Ukrainians sealed off, in effect, from contacts with the Europeans, the Democrats in the United States, and people like that. So that fact was interesting in itself. And the other interesting fact about these talks is the omission of Zelensky from the Ukrainian delegation. The Americans met with Zelensky in Washington. He came to the Oval Office. There was the huge row. Zelensky proved impossible. He was not prepared to bend on the question of a ceasefire. He continued to insist on security guarantees. He continued to insist on security guarantees with respect to the mineral rights extraction agreement. And he made it pretty clear that he wanted the security guarantees to be provided by the United States. He said, in fact, in interviews that he gave, that only the United States could give meaningful security guarantees. Only security guarantees provided by the United States would do. Well, the Ukrainians have agreed to a ceasefire that they had consistently rejected. They have consistently, up to now, refused a ceasefire. And they have accepted a ceasefire without getting from the Americans any sort of commitment to security guarantees for Ukraine. Now, there is another omission as well, because there is no reference in this paragraph to the deployment of European peacekeepers, to those peacekeepers being provided by the United States with a backstop, in other words, with some kind of security guarantee. There's no hint here of any actual direct US or NATO involvement whatsoever. There's no talk about no-fly zones or any of the things that were coming out of Emmanuel Macron's fertile mind and which Zelensky was persuaded to latch on. All of that has been dropped and has fallen away. To anticipate that doesn't mean that these dreadful ideas might not be revived, but the Americans, perhaps, in fact, I'm sure, were asked by the Ukrainians over the course of the Jeddah discussions to agree to some of these things, but the Americans agreed to none of them. And then we have the next section. The United States will communicate to Russia that Russian reciprocity is the key to achieving peace. Now, this is a very interesting sentence, actually. Firstly, it's the United States that is going to communicate to Russia, not the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, of course, don't have diplomatic representation in Russia, and the Russians don't any longer have diplomatic representatives in Kiev. But, of course, the Ukrainians and the Russians could meet. They do have contacts. They arrange prisoner exchanges through the Emir of Qatar, for example, on a fairly regular basis. They have contacts in Saudi Arabia. No, it will be the United States and the United States alone that will act as the party that communicates information from one side in this conflict to the other. And the United States will communicate to Russia that Russian reciprocity is the key to achieving peace. Now, that does not talk about Russia agreeing to a ceasefire as being the key to achieving peace, though it could be extended to mean that. And if you look at the comments that Waltz and Rubio made directly after the meeting, they too seem to think that the obvious reciprocity from the Russians would be for the Russians to agree to the ceasefire, and Trump has talked in the same way. But in the joint statement, it doesn't say that the Russians must agree to the ceasefire. They must take reciprocal steps as a way forward to achieving peace. We're not told what those steps might be. We're not told what this Russian reciprocity must be. Obviously, agreeing to a ceasefire is the obvious form of reciprocity, but it doesn't exclude the possibility that there might be other ones. And then we're told that the United States will immediately lift the pause on intelligence sharing and resume security assistance to Ukraine. And that, of course, has begun, and it is basically built around this idea that the Ukrainians have moved towards the US position. They are now finally cooperating with the United States in the efforts that the United States is making to achieve peace in Ukraine. The United States is taking the initiative. It's the United States which will communicate to Russia. It's President Trump who hopes that he will be speaking to President Putin shortly. Just saying. It's the United States that is, in effect, in charge now of the whole negotiating process. And now that the Ukrainians have accepted that, well, the Americans can give them intelligence and security assistance again. And then we have a paragraph. The delegations also discuss the importance of humanitarian relief efforts as part of the peace process. That will be uncontroversial, particularly during the above-mentioned ceasefire, including the exchange of prisoners of war, the release of civilian detainees, and the most difficult part of this for the Russians, the return of forcibly transferred Ukrainian children. The Russians, of course, bitterly opposed this. I suspect that the Ukrainians insisted on it. The Americans went along with it. Anyway, then we have the next paragraph, which is in some ways every bit as important as the paragraph about the ceasefire. Both delegations agreed to name their negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations towards an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. The United States committed to discussing these specific proposals with representatives from Russia. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated that European partners shall be involved in the peace process. This is very careful and rather twisted language, and it suggests that this was the most difficult paragraph to agree of all. So firstly, both delegations agreed to name their negotiating teams and immediately begin negotiations towards an enduring peace that provides for Ukraine's long-term security. So, first thing to notice here, Ukraine is going to set up a negotiating team, but so is the United States. The United States is going to be directly involved in the negotiations. It's going to actually appoint negotiators, and there's talk about starting negotiations immediately. Now, the Americans have been talking about the fact that a ceasefire is needed to get the negotiations started. I'm going to anticipate by saying that the Russians are going to push back on that. They're going to say, why do we need a ceasefire at all? Many negotiations happen over the course of wars. That's absolutely standard, and it doesn't follow that because the parties are negotiating with each other that there has to be a ceasefire. So that's what the Russians may say. But the Russians are also saying that, but this paragraph also talks about the negotiations starting immediately. So that there must be a rush to begin negotiations. So it's looking at a three-party negotiation. Russia, Ukraine, and the United States. The United States, Ukraine, and Russia all in the same room, all negotiating with each other. One wonders what the Russians will make of all of that. But anyway, that's what has been agreed here. The United States committed to discussing these specific proposals with representatives from Russia. So again, it's the Americans, not the Ukrainians, who are taking the initiative here. They are the people who will be approaching the Russians. They're the people who are in effect in charge. The Ukrainians may have their negotiating team, but one can't help but feel that the way this is going to play out in the end is that if these negotiations do ever begin with these three delegations all there, the negotiations are going to be between the Americans and the Russians principally. The Ukrainians will be in the room, which may be not, by the way, a particularly good idea, but it's been made clear to them over the last 2 weeks that they are subordinate to the Americans. The Americans switched off intelligence assistance and military supplies. They can switch them on again, but if the Ukrainians don't play ball, they can be switched off again as well. And then I find it extraordinary sentence in the whole statement. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated that European partners shall be involved in the peace process. The Ukrainian delegation reiterated. What does the Americans think? What do the Americans say about this? Nothing, apparently. The Americans are not suggesting, there's no suggestion here that the Europeans should set up their own negotiating teams. It's purely the Ukrainians who are insisting that the Europeans must be involved in some way. The Americans are apparently not interested in that. They want to conduct the negotiations with the Russians. The Ukrainians can tag along, will tag along. But it's not the Americans who want the European partners involved. It is the Ukrainians and they alone. I suspect that this sentence took a lot of negotiation, and the Ukrainians almost certainly pressed the Americans for words to agree that the European partners should be involved, and it's clear that the Americans refused. And then we have the last paragraph. Lastly, both countries' presidents agreed to conclude as soon as possible a comprehensive agreement for developing Ukraine's critical mineral resources to expand Ukraine's economy and guarantee Ukraine's long-term prosperity and security. But the interesting thing here is that we're told that both countries' presidents agreed to that, which is interesting because though Zelensky has previously said that he agreed to it, subject to the security guarantees that, note, are not being provided, the military security guarantees. He's supposed to have agreed to this in this meeting, even though, of course, he's not there. He didn't actually sign this joint statement. Presumably, he approved it before it was issued. Anyway, there we go. So, where does this leave us? Now, let's start with the ceasefire, which is the thing that, understandably enough, is attracting so much interest. The Americans have been obsessed with this idea of getting a ceasefire. They've been talking about it for, well, ever since Donald Trump became president and even to some extent before. The idea of a ceasefire was there in General Kellogg's original April 2024 article. The Russians have consistently rejected a temporary ceasefire. They say they've been there in the past. They say that they agreed temporary ceasefires with Ukraine in September 2014, in February 2015, the Minsk Agreement, in the weeks after the beginning of the special military operation, on many occasions, in fact. And the Ukrainians have violated every single one of these ceasefires. And the Russians have always said that the only way a ceasefire can take effect is if there is as part of an overall settlement, which, as they say, addresses the root causes of the conflict. In other words, which ends the conflict finally and conclusively. They say that if any other ceasefire in any other form were ever agreed, one, the Ukrainians would probably violate it. Two, there would be a very real high probability that the negotiations would be spun on indefinitely and that there would be a frozen conflict, and one which would be used by Ukraine and its various Western backers to undertake a massive rearmament process. So, leading to further wars down the line. So that's been the consistent Russian position. And contrary to what some people believe, I suspect, I'm sure, that the Russians are going to stick to that position. The Russians have been reiterating this continuously in comment after comment, in speech after speech. Lavrov, in a massive, monumental interview he gave to various American bloggers and commentators, including my friend Larry Johnson, just saying, once again said that the Russians are in no mood to compromise, and I took that to mean on this or any other substantive point. I know some people want to believe that the Russians will agree to this ceasefire. I don't really see why they would, and I don't think they will. So, 30-day ceasefire has been proposed by the Americans. The Americans doing that thing which Eve Smith talked about in that article about a year plus ago, the same thing that George Beebe talked about in a program which we discussed, in which Glenn Deason and I discussed the conflict with him. The Americans negotiating with themselves, negotiating with the Europeans and the Ukrainians, not paying sufficient attention to what the Russians are saying, convincing themselves that they know better than the Russians what the Russians want to do, which is to end the war as quickly as possible, perhaps believing that the Russians are suffering heavier casualties than they are suffering, suffering more damage to their economy than they are suffering. The Americans, as I said, have had this idea about the ceasefire at the back of their minds ever since this conflict began. Now, I think what's going to happen, and this is my view, is that probably Putin is going to speak to Trump at some point over the next couple of days, maybe even today. Steve Witkoff is apparently going to go to Moscow tomorrow when he'll be meeting Russian officials. Perhaps Putin himself, though it's worth pointing out that tomorrow Putin also hosts Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, who's coming to Moscow on a long-standing visit, and presumably Putin is going to have to spend much of tomorrow discussing various things with Lukashenko, who is an important guest, and he may not have quite as much time for Witkoff as the Americans expect. Also, I should say that it is very much in Putin's style and very, very much in the Russian style to keep the other side waiting and guessing, to basically throw them off balance. The Russians are not above playing psychological games in negotiations. They do it often, and they do it very, very well. But I expect that when the Russians are finally presented with all of this, they will say, look, of course we want to see the fighting end. Of course we want to see a cessation of hostilities. But we cannot have this kind of unconditional ceasefire. We've already explained why, but that doesn't mean that we're rejecting everything that you're bringing to us. You came forward with some very positive and good points from Jeddah. We see that you want to negotiate. We're absolutely ready to negotiate. We will do exactly as you wish. We will set up our own negotiating team. If the Ukrainians want to negotiate, that's absolutely fine. We are willing to negotiate with them as well. And if you want this to be a tripartite discussion, one in which we are negotiating with you and the Ukrainians are also there, well, we're not going to object to that either. So we're absolutely willing to go along with this. We need to agree the venue. We need to agree the place where this will all happen. We also need to set up a timetable. But we agree that this can be done. And we also agree that this negotiation process should begin quickly. But we cannot agree this 30-day ceasefire. And we don't agree that a ceasefire is needed to start a negotiation process. We've had lots of experiences with ceasefires before in this conflict. They've always turned out to our disadvantage. We're not going to fall for it again this time. So let's negotiate. Let's get forward. Let's move on with the negotiations. And besides, it really isn't a good idea to just come and present us with a fait accompli in this way. To decide something between Ukraine and the United States, to get all your European allies to agree to this. This is a bilateral discussion that Ukraine and the United States have had with each other. We were not consulted. We were not involved. If the question of a negotiation, of a ceasefire, is going to be approached properly, if it's ever going to happen, then the obvious and correct place for that to happen and for the terms of the ceasefire to be properly agreed is in the negotiations, as a result of the negotiations themselves. That's what normally happens in wars. The parties meet, they discuss things with each other, they move forward, they establish common positions, trust gradually is built up, and out of that process, perhaps a ceasefire comes. That is the right way to do it. You're putting the cart before the horse, and this really isn't going to work. And it isn't going to work this time. So, while we're saying no, that doesn't mean, you shouldn't take this to mean as a sign that we're not prepared to talk. And, of course, if you want to start providing intelligence and military assistance to Ukraine again, well, all you're doing, of course, is prolonging the war. But we've shown already that we can deal with all of that. We're not going to be intimidated by something like that. That's pressure you're putting on Ukraine. You mustn't make the mistake of thinking that the fact that you're resuming intelligence sharing and military assistance to Ukraine, that puts any sort of pressure on us. I expect that the Russians, Putin, Lavrov, will be saying very much those sort of things to the Americans over the next couple of days. So, contrary to what some people are saying, I think that this is not a test now for the Russians. If I am right in my assessment of what the Russians are going to do, I think this is more going to be a test for Trump and for the United States. The Russians come round and say, look, we're prepared to negotiate. We are willing to send our delegation to Jeddah or Riyadh or Minsk, as we've suggested, or Ankara or Istanbul, or wherever you like. We're prepared to sit down and talk with you and talk with the Ukrainians in the format that you've suggested. But we're not prepared to agree to this 30-day ceasefire that you're talking about. That might come out of the negotiating process, but it cannot be simply presented to us in this way with the expectation that we will simply agree to it. If the Russians say that, which is, I think, quite likely what the Russians are going to say, then the test for the Americans will be this. Do they storm out in fury? Do they accuse the Russians of being committed to continuing the war? Do they decide that the time has come to impose more pressure on the Russians, to crank up the sanctions, to do all of those sort of things? Or do they do what the Russians suggest and actually get the negotiation process started? If the Americans do the first, then the war will continue. And, well, we saw in Kursk how fragile the position of the Ukrainian military probably is, or possibly is. The Russians, anyway, are winning the war. Expectations that the Russian economy is going to collapse or break down under the weight of any further sanctions the United States might impose is hugely misplaced, in my opinion. There are already signals, as I said, of recession building up in the United States and across the entire global economy. There are also some signs that inflationary pressures are growing. Taking that approach would be hugely counterproductive. It would be massively mistaken. It would perhaps endanger the prospects of any further negotiations going forward. So if the Americans, as I said, lose their temper, throw a tantrum, walk away, then, as I said, that would be a serious mistake. Much better for the Americans to go along with what the Russians are saying. Now, there will be criticism. There will be people who say that there has been no ceasefire. But the Russians will say, well, there were negotiations to bring the Korean War to a conclusion, and there was no ceasefire. There were years of negotiations to get the Vietnam War, at least American involvement in the war in Vietnam, resolved, negotiations in Paris, and there was no ceasefire. Donald Trump himself was involved in negotiations with the Taliban in Doha, and those took many years also. And again, there was no ceasefire. Why insist on a ceasefire now? Why insist on something like that? Why not instead talk? And going back to that article that I discussed 2 or 3 days ago, the one which went through all of those previous conflicts, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, remember the pattern. The Americans initially come up with all sorts of ideas, push back, take very strong positions, or appear to do so. But under pressure of events, the fact that the war is being lost, the fact that the international position of the United States is being damaged, eventually, as the negotiations evolve, they start to give way, step by step, and then a peace agreement, which in the case of the conflict in Ukraine will probably be along the lines of Istanbul Plus, is finally reached. And as Peskov, Putin's spokesman, said yesterday, Istanbul Plus actually is not a maximalist or unreasonable proposal. So that is what I think is most likely to happen. The Russians have already indirectly indicated that they're not strongly interested in this temporary ceasefire. There's been an article to that effect in Reuters. Of course, one shouldn't perhaps place too much reliance on what Reuters says, but I saw in TASS an article from a reference to an article, an interview with a Russian officer, Colonel Levon Arzanov. He's retired, but is a member of the Presidium of the All-Russia Organization Officers of Russia, semi-official organization, but one that almost certainly speaks for the military. He says, considering Vladimir Zelensky's unpredictability and unscrupulousness, I believe Ukraine will try to provoke us. Even if a 30-day ceasefire is agreed upon, I expect it will be violated by the Ukrainian side. We must remain vigilant and under no circumstances align ourselves with Kiev. And that's already a statement. Obviously, it's by an unofficial spokesman. The Russians most likely will not want to poison discussions before they've actually spoken with the Americans. Peskov has said that they haven't yet been briefed by the Americans about what was actually discussed and agreed in Jeddah. But, as I said, I am I'm fairly confident that this is the position that the Russians are going to take. And I suspect that even if ideas of ceasefires and such things eventually fall away, this US administration is now far too deeply committed to a peace process in Ukraine, ultimately to walk away, and negotiations of some kind will begin. Now, here I should say that one of the great problems which I encounter when discussing negotiations to conflicts of this kind is that there is very, very little memory today in the West of how negotiations to end these complex wars actually happen. In my experience, and I have memories that extend back to the late 60s and certainly to the 1970s, it's not uncommon at the start of a negotiating process for one side or the other to make some big pitch, to make some big public offer like a 30-day ceasefire, as in this case, an offer which the other side will mostly reject. It's classic positioning in ahead of negotiations. And if it's conducted in that sort of way, then actually it's more a sign that negotiations are going to start to happen rather than a sign that these proposals should in themselves be taken as make or break proposals, which, if they're rejected, will cause the entire process to break down. Throughout the various conflicts that I can remember, the Vietnam War, the Paris peace talks, and all of that, all sorts of things of that nature used to happen. Now, the other thing I will say, and this is a secondary point, is that though the Russians seem to me to be very, very well versed and very ready for negotiations of this kind, in the sense that they are well-trained and formidable negotiators with strong institutional memory of how negotiations of this kind are conducted. Remember, Lavrov has served continuously in the Russian Foreign Ministry since the 1970s, and most of the Russian officials who will be making up the Russian negotiating team are very, very skilled and also very experienced in conducting negotiations. That is simply not true of the American side. Trump, Rubio, Waltz, and Wyckoff may be capable people in many respects, but none of them has any experience at all of conducting negotiations at this level. And there is no real support from within the US bureaucracy that they can draw upon. The State Department, which absolutely did once have people who did conduct negotiations with the Russians in a very effective way during the Cold War, long ago fell prey to the neocons. The neocons don't believe in negotiations. They don't believe in diplomacy. The result is that instead of diplomats, you've got people who are basically highly paid loudmouths who mostly created trouble. I do not see that depth of negotiating expertise in the United States at any level of the US government which once existed and which, properly speaking, you would need in a conflict of this kind. You simply do not have people like, Gerard Smith or Paul Nietzsche or people of that sort whom I remember. Not all of them, by the way, I liked or had much time for. I didn't like Paul Nietzsche at all, but that he was a formidably strong negotiator. I knew what he was doing. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt. And, the Americans are going to have to learn all of those skills again. And to repeat once more, I think that if the Trump people really want this to work out well, they should seek advice from those veteran foreign affairs officers who have done this thing before. They're old and retired now, but they're still there. I'm thinking of people like Ambassadors Chas Freeman and Jack Matlock. I think it would be a good idea to have some discussions with them, to speak with them, to find out from them how negotiations like this are conducted, so that these negotiations, when they do start to happen in a more organized and effective way than perhaps we're seeing at the moment. I say that because, to repeat again, if you're going to really want to push towards a ceasefire, then the way to do it is through negotiations with the other side, not by presenting the idea of a ceasefire to the other side without negotiations. It's a classic example of the point that Eve Smith and George Bieber have both made, of negotiating with yourself and presenting a take it or leave it proposition to the other side before the negotiations even begin, and finding yourself embarrassed when the other side says no. So anyway, let's wait and see what happens. It's likely that over the next couple of days, the Russians and the Americans will talk. The Russians are waiting for Mr. Witkoff to arrive in Moscow. He'll probably meet Lavrov at least and others, and there'll no doubt be a debriefing exercise, and then the Russians will have their own say. I don't myself expect that they will agree to this 30-day ceasefire idea. I expect that they will make some pretty strong comments about Zelensky and the fact that the Ukrainians cannot be trusted. But I think the Russians will say, let's nonetheless stick with this. Whatever you decide to do, even if you decide to impose more sanctions upon us or to step up your military supplies to Ukraine, we're not going to be happy with any of that. We think that is a big mistake. But nonetheless, let's stick with this. Let's talk and let's see where this is going. Now, there's a few further points I want to make. Firstly, I think that Donald Trump and the Americans repeatedly talking about the tragedy that all of these deaths in this unnecessary war have caused. I think up to now, I found that a humane thing. And as I said, it does make a difference with the utterly callous and cynical behavior of other Western leaders, including the current leaders of Europe. But I think that President Trump, Secretary Rubio, Vice President Vance, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz do need to remember something, which is that the judgment about whether the sacrifice of lives, of Russian lives, in this war is worthwhile, is one that ultimately is going to be made in Russia, not the United States. Harping on this question to the Russians, why are you continuing with the war and sacrificing your people in this way when we could have a deal, is something which, if it's persisted in for too long, may eventually start to grate. And that is probably not a good way of conducting negotiations, especially with a country like Russia. Just saying. The second is that the Americans are going to need to keep the Ukrainians under control. I'm not sure it's a good idea to involve the Ukrainians in negotiations if the United States really does intend to ultimately negotiate this directly with the Russians. That's, however, the decision that's been made. But The Americans will need to understand that the Ukrainians in that case, and Zelensky in particular, need to be kept on a very tight leash indeed. And it might, in fact, still be a good idea if the US continues to explore alternative options for leaders in Kiev. Just saying. The third point I want to make is that I was very interested in this interview that Lavrov gave to the American bloggers, and not just because, as I said, I happen to know one of them, Larry Johnson, and consider him a friend. But I found it very interesting how Lavrov again brought up the whole concept of federalization of Ukraine, one which he, as he pointed out, discussed extensively with American officials, including US Secretary of State Kelly, back in the spring of 2014, and which for a time seemed to be an idea whose time had come. I wonder whether at some point the fact that Lavrov is bringing it up in interviews like this, whether that might mean that this question of federalization might be brought up by the Russians in future negotiations, in future negotiations, in the negotiations, when looking again at the post-war character, structure, constitution of Ukraine. It would not surprise me at all. And I should say that in terms of Ukraine and its internal stability, it's probably the best way forward. The next point I'm going to make is that I think that expectations that many people seem to have that Russia's international position will be damaged if it says no to this 30-day ceasefire, that China and the global south will somehow be annoyed with the Russians. I think that is completely wrong. I think the Chinese have made fairly clear already that they understand the Russian position very well and will support it. And I think that as far as the global south is concerned, they've made their minds up about the origins of this war for quite some time now. I think they will understand the Russian perspective of things. And besides, their policies are based on their own conceptions of self-interest. I don't think it's going to have any significant effect, any effect on Russia's international position whatsoever. And as for the Europeans, well, we see the cracks beginning to grow. Italy is apparently deciding to boycott Starmer's latest summit, the coalition of the willing idea. Meloni has apparently come to a clear decision that sending Italian troops to Ukraine in any shape or form is an extremely bad idea indeed, and it looks like she's going to reject it. And my sense is anyway that the Americans are turning against this idea also. I am going to make a guess that the fact that this proposal is not mentioned anywhere in the joint statement between the Americans and the Ukrainians, that strongly suggests to me that on this issue, at least, the Americans are finally listening to the Russians. My final point remains that it is the military calculus, the military events on the battlefield that will eventually dictate the outcome. Ukraine has just suffered a catastrophic defeat, the worst it's ever suffered over the course of the special military operation. The Russians are advancing. They have no reason or incentive to rush into ceasefires or peace agreements which they feel do not fulfill their fundamental interests. On the contrary, the fact that they're advancing is going to make them prepared to take an even stronger position than they might otherwise do. That isn't going to be reversed. It does mean that the United States perhaps ought to be prepared to make more concessions to the Russians sooner, because I noticed that one of the other points Lavrov said in this long interview is that the longer this takes, the stronger, the harder the Russian position is likely to be. That's what I'm going to say today about this negotiation process. I think perhaps people are putting too much weight on this ceasefire idea. I expect it perhaps to ebb away, but I still think that we are now in a situation where the United States has committed itself to negotiations. And that's perhaps the most important thing to take from what came out of Jeddah. Anyway, that's where I finish my program today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that we have all our various programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. If you like this video, please tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.